Hello to all of our viewers, from webtoons to dramas to novels. Talk about and explore Korea stories with us. Welcome to Who Reads Story. My name is An Sung-jin and I'm a reporter, and I'm glad to be taking over reporter Song Yu-jin's spot at Who Reads Story. Now, last time I heard that we talked about part 1 of author Han Kang's Human Acts. It's a book that I personally enjoy as well, so I'm excited to have good discussions today as well. And today we have Andrea with us. Hello, Andrea.
Hello, nice to meet you. Good to see you today.
Great to be here with you. Now, to ask you a little bit on getting to know you, I know that you read this book, but I also heard that you enjoy Korean books in general as well.
Yes, I started reading Korean literature like in 2022, and because of a book fair that it was in Bogota. And then I just find out that there was a book club regarding Korean literature that was created in 2021. They have read more than 30 books till now, and then I entered this book club in 2023, and we have read not just like Korean writers, but also some other writers talking about Korea. So it's really interesting.
Right, so to have a book club that talks about completely different cultures way across the globe, what does this mean for you?
Well, it has been like a really interesting experience. Something that for us as Colombians, it's really interesting is that Colombia participated during the Korean War. And because of that, there are some books of veterans, like Colombian veterans, like talking about their experiences during the Korean War here. So some of the books that we were reading was regarding that, but also Korean authors, and then authors like from Korean diaspora, like in United States and in other places, because it's interesting to know more of Korea and Korean culture through literature. So something that is like, I don't know, really good of this experience is that you have the opportunity to share with others. So you read a book and then you have a lot of things to say. And then it's like, okay, I like this part, I like this character. What do you think about it? And then you have the experience to share and also to listen like from different perspectives.
Right, so not only is it very meaningful, but you also get the shared experience with others that are in the book club. So last time we talked about chapter 1 and chapter 2, and I'm excited to be talking about the rest today. So now actually, as we dive into the latter parts from chapter 3 to 6, author Han Kang in chapter 1 to 2 really focuses more on the events and how those happen. And in the latter chapters, she talks about what happened after the incident. She talks a lot about the survivors. Why do you think author Han Kang structured her novel this way?
I think it's really realistic, like in the sense that it's not just about the events that happened during those 10 days or like the historical things that we can talk about like 45 years ago. It's also about like the people that were there, the people that survived, how they are dealing after 5, 10, and even 30 years, like with those open wounds, that there are still no like close scars like to those things that happened. So I think the structure of the book is playing with this idea that it's not just about the event itself, it's also about what happened after.
Right, I think it's important that we actually talk about not just what happened during that time, but we also focus on what after is actually happening. And when you were reading this book, what did you think about it?
Well, in my case, it was really like emotional because I was already in Gwangju, and then like to be, I don't know, like feeling that I was already in those buildings, that I have been like kind of in the same place that those like traumatic things happen. It was like really, I don't know, vivid again. But also, I think that I connected like with other parts of the world, because when we talk about traumatic experience, sadly, it's not just a Korean experience. We are talking about stuff that happened in other parts of the world. So, for instance, in Colombia, there was a period of the violence in the 20th century, but apart from that period, there was like during the 20th century a lot of student movements that some of those students were also killed. So I think that it was interesting how in this book you can see some of these experiences like through like each chapter.
Right, so I don't know much about the incident that happened in Colombia, but what can you say are some aspects that see a parallel with the events that happened in Korea?
Well, in 1929, there was a student that was killed by the militaries, and 30 years later, there was a commemoration for this student in 1954, and some of the students there were also killed, and there was a massacre. And something that it's interesting is that, and sadly, is that those that want to talk about what happened, those that want to talk about the truth, sometimes they became victims too. And then like this idea of commemoration, it's something that we can see replicated there and here, because when this traumatic experience happened, like the community, people decide like to talk about it and to not stay silent, which is important, like for not uncovering the truth, like not for letting just these historical events to be, I don't know, like just a background or something of that kind.
Right, I guess as you mentioned, it's important that we not only talk about the event itself, but we actually focus on the people as well and hear their stories. It's actually interesting to see how, even though they're two different countries in two different time frames, the pain that these people go through, that humanity goes through, is actually similar. Which is why when we see chapter 3 to 6, we focus on the common theme of survivors, and we see 4 different peoples that live in different time frames. It's interesting because this whole structure of seeing it as an omniverse, I think that's something that adds on to the interesting part of the novel and the story itself.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting how in the structure of the book we are like playing like with the years, and then how when you go to chapter 3 and then you see, okay, 5 years later, then 10 years later, then 22, then 30, and you are like kind of seeing like the experience of different people, but at the same time they are still kind of marked by what happened. And then how through their discourses, how through their even activities or the way that they live their lives, it's seen that, well, that somehow they are still traumatized about what happened and how they cannot forget. Because in every case, there are like some of these like talking like by themselves, like, well, when I see this, when I experience this. And something that it's interesting, it's also like how despite of many years past, they still remember Dongho, and they still kind of feel guilty and put blame on themselves because they didn't die and they were survivors. So I think that that can be also an interesting view of those people that survive, how there is also guilty for being alive.
Right, so as you mentioned, it's actually interesting to see how the novel surrounds around these characters in different time frames. But why do you think the author might have structured her novel this way?
I think that Han Kang decided to do it in this way, actually to show that despite that there are like years and years like just passing, the woods are still there, and that there is still people that remember. And I think that's something that it's like quite important, is that it's not just about those that live there. It's important also how, like, through with the activities that they do, other people that were involved, they can also somehow remember, they can also somehow know what happened.
And out of all the characters, which character do you think stuck with you the most, or which character did you emphasize with the most? Because there are several characters that have all these different stories, and I'm sure each of them have their own uniqueness.
Yeah, well, I really like every chapter, and it was a little bit difficult for me to choose just one. However, I really like the main character of chapter number 3, that it was Eun-suk. Like in this chapter, it's talking about how she decided to forget how a person that belongs to the government at that moment slapped her like 7 times. And then how, like, through the process of she remembering what happened, she kind of feel more ease about like the situation at that moment. But something that I really like about her is that she was working in a publishing house. She was working like in an editorial, and how like through this chapter, it's able to, the reader is able to see how censorship at that moment was a really important part of life at that. So when she says, I'm going like to the censor office, I'm going to see if we can publish this, The play has like this censor. So all of those parts, I think that they were really interesting. Also, when I was reading that, I remember this book that is called Gwangju Diary. And the first edition of this book was published actually in that year, in 1985. And then like the authors couldn't use like their real names, so they used the name of a famous novelist at that time, like for publishing. And they were unaware, or more like they were afraid of being put in jail, yeah, and like to experience this kind of stuff, because it was just 5 years later. So I think that this is an example of how censorship was like really hard like to broke at that time. So that's why I really like her character.
Right, so as you mentioned, I guess the novel not only talks about the character itself, but it also really goes over the censorship issues and what actually was happening during then in that historical background. For me personally, I enjoyed actually chapter 5 where they talk about Sunju. It's also a chapter that author Han Kang mentioned that she also quite put a lot of effort into. The last line that the character actually says is "Don't die," which author Han Kang said is also a line that is meaningful and is also important. And I guess this chapter on its own not only focused on the character, but as you mentioned, it also focuses a lot on the historical background and what was actually happening during that incident as well.
Yeah, I think that like Han Kang, when she is using like the character of something, it's really good how she kind of put her voice.
Right.
Yeah, like her voice is through the character.
Right.
So in that sense, I think it's really meaningful.
Right. So as you say, I guess Han Kang in a way is reflecting the historical period and her own voice through the characters, which is why it actually comes as something more meaningful. And so for you, Andrea, for those who haven't read the book yet, or for those of our viewers who would be interested in being exposed to this book, is there a particular sentence or like a phrase that you'd be willing to share?
Yes, I would like to share one part like from chapter 3. And I really like this part because it's like when Enso, she just arrived at her house, she's able to escape like everything that happened, and then someone was following her, and then her father just go out and said like, well, here there is nobody that was participating. And after there is just like this part, I'm going to read it.
Go ahead.
So when she finally came down from the loft the next evening, her mother informed her that the corpses have been loaded into the city garbage trucks and driven off to a mass grave. Not just those that have been dumped in front of the fountain, even the unidentified bodies, the ones that have been kept in coffins in the gymnasium, all have been taken away. This part for me gave me chills because when I went to the cemetery in Gwangju, I think it was really interesting to see the districtal cemetery and the national cemetery that was created later in the 90s, and how even in the epilogue of Han Kang book, she mentioned how she visited the grave at the end and how she felt like connection while she was doing research for writing the book. So that part was like really meaningful for me when I was reading it.
Right. So I guess if any of our viewers are later reading on this book, maybe keep in mind that the sentence that Andrea just mentioned, and later when they're going back through it, they can probably maybe look back at it or read it once more. So now when we look at chapter from 1 to 6, we see so many diverse characters in different time historical backgrounds. And we also think about the question what it means to be human, or what humanity in it is, which is why I feel like it reflects the English title of Human Acts. When you're thinking about the book title itself, is there anything new that you maybe realized of the title itself or the novel?
I think that like when you talk about humanity, it's kind of a hard question because like we humans are like built of so many experiences that there can be bad or they can be good, and how like there are like so many cruel things, but at the same time like many beautiful stuff. And then how like with the actions of some people you can say like, oh, humanity is there. Like for instance, when Dong Ho was searching for his friend, how he was just searching for him, and despite that later we find out what happened and that he already knew what happened with his friend, like this sensation of like this is wrong, and then the conscience of I'm going to fight for it. I think that somehow humanity is like in those kind of, let's say, activities or actions.
Right, so I guess we can see a glimpse of humanities through the characters that we're reading in the novel. And I guess author Han Kang said something similar. She made a meaningful remark after she received the Nobel Prize for Literature. And when I read the interview that she did in the background, or like why she has written this novel, she talks about how this duality of humanity is actually an irreconcilable dilemma for her.
Yeah, I think that somehow when we talk about humanity, it's a core question like in the whole book. Like with each character, we are seeing like how they survive or how they didn't survive in the case of the two first chapters, and how like later, like through their lives, we are seeing like the struggles, but at the same time, like how it's beautiful to live, how like despite of these like tragic memories, it's still it's good like to stay alive. So I think at the last part of chapter number 4, they are talking about the experience of one of the prisoners that he knew, one of the main characters there. And then he said like to this professor that is doing the research, like, I'm a human being that I need to live like with everything that happened, how I was like in prison for this year, like all of the things that happened to me there. And then you are also a human being. How can we kind of share our experiences and live and continue like somehow supporting each other, like for, I don't know, continue surviving?
Right, so I guess it really does bring out the question of humanity. So as a passionate reader yourself, and as a historian, since you've majored in this realm,
Yeah.
what are some overviews you can give about this book in general?
Well, I think that, well, as I said before, if you haven't read the book, please read it. Like, it's a really interesting book. You are going to cry, but I think it's worth it. Even if you cried, it's worth it. And you are going to enjoy like every chapter. And for me personally, I think that you can also kind of establish a relation related with personal memory and collective memory, and how collective memory it's also related not just like with every character, but with people that is not mentioned there. And I like to mention that related with the chapter number 6, because when we see the mother of Dong Ho, we see like this story of this mother that lost his child, how later she need to deal like with this losing, but how also she decide to be part of a community of other families, of other relatives of people that died at that time, and they want to fight, but fight in the sense of finding the truth, fight in the sense of build community. So I think that is something that is really interesting, like in the book, like also with the last chapter, that it's just not about those that survive and those that were, let's say, directly affected by what happened, but also how with people, with Koreans in general, it's possible to create community even nowadays, because there is like this community in Gwangju that is the Mothers of May. And then there is also the May 18 Foundation, and there are others that have been just like appearing through the years, even nowadays with the students. And I think that's really hopeful.
Right, absolutely. So I guess it's not just about the story itself. It also unfolds what other historical events that happen, the people that are around them, not only about the characters that are actually in the novel, but as you mentioned, we see it kind of seep into modern day as well. Now, as someone that knows a lot about Korean history, if there's a book or if there's a story that you'd like to recommend to our viewers as well, is there anything that you could tell us about?
Well, in my case, actually, I wrote about Gwangju in my undergrad thesis, and that was thanks to A Taxi Driver. A Taxi Driver is a movie from 2017 that tells the story of a taxi driver in Gwangju that was like with a journalist. This was a German journalist that came like to the country, and how through this story, it's this journalist is able like to show what was happening in Gwangju during those days. And then there is also Youth of May, that is a drama that was released in 2021. That I think is, you are going to cry with that one too, but it's really good. And maybe this is not about Gwangju, it's later, but if you are interested related like with like the democratic movement in Korea, something that can be interesting is 1987, when the day comes, that is about the June uprising. So to learn a little bit about this student from Seoul National University that was killed, and later like this Johnson student Lee Han-yeol, that actually there is a museum of him that was created by his mother. So it's really good like to have like these cultural products in which you can learn more about like Korean history. So those are some of my recommendations. But also, if you are able to come to Korea and go to Gwangju, go to the Chonal building. Right now there is this exhibition. This exhibition is about some journalists, and not just journalists, like foreigners that were here during the uprising and how they held at that time. Well, there is also an exhibition regarding Han Kang and human acts in the archive. So, well, there are many things that they can just search. Those are some.
You know so much about Korean history, and specifically talking about this time period and time era as well. So now if any of our viewers are further interested in the Gwangju Uprising, there are several more pieces, as Andrea just mentioned, and there are some also ongoing exhibitions. So if any of our viewers are interested, they should tune in and find out what they can actually go and see in Korea. Well, thank you for sharing such a great story, Andrea. I feel like I've learned a lot from you today just by your stories. Now, if all of our viewers have liked our story, please leave a comment on what it was like today, and thank you for being here with us.